I'm going to ask Julianne to come up again, who will lead our next panel. And that is Moving Equality Forward with the Tools for Equality and Peace. Cities for CEDAW campaign. With that, please welcome Julianne.
I'm going to start out by talking about the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. You've heard us use the acronym CEDAW, so that's what we're talking about. I want to give you like a 5 or 7 minute lesson in something that in a law school class or otherwise you would spend like an hour or 2 or maybe 3 hours and stuff. But I just want to give you an idea of the richness of what we call the International Bill of Human Rights for Women. Now, let me just say from the beginning that all human rights treaties and documents protect women, because we're talking about peoples, men, women all over the world. But the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women specifically talks about women's issues, women, and when I say women and girls, it talks about gender equality, and this is a specific treaty that we're talking about, but as I say, the context is all of the human rights treaties, whether you're talking about torture, racial discrimination, economic, social, and cultural rights, and what have you. But for this purpose, Article 1 defines discrimination against women. It's a broad definition, so just listen. Distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex, which has the effect or purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise by women, irrespective of marital status, on the basis of equality between men and women, of human rights, of fundamental freedom in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. It's very broad. It's one of the few human rights treaties that not only talks about civil and political rights, but economic, social, and cultural rights. Article 2 mandates that states, when I say states, countries, take concrete steps to implement laws, policies, and practices to eliminate discrimination against women and embody the principle of equality. Women are fundamentally equal with men in all spheres of life, says Article 3. It requires action in all fields, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural, to advance the human rights of women. Article 4 provides for taking special measures, and if you translate that to here in the U.S., it permits affirmative action measures to accelerate equality and eliminate discrimination. And in a number of countries, they have actually passed quotas, and that is within the scope of this particular article. Article 5 recognizes the role of culture and tradition and calls for the elimination of sex role stereotyping. Article 6 talks about trafficking. It requires suppression of traffic in women and exploitation of prostitutes. And if you reflect on what you have heard on the television, the daily news, or what have you on a number of issues, you can see how relevant this is. Article 7 talks about political and public life. It mandates ending discrimination against women in political and public life. Article 8 talks about international work, and it requires action to allow women to represent their governments internationally on an equal basis with men. And if you go to some of these international meetings at the UN, you look at the number or the lack thereof of women on the delegations or women speaking on behalf of their countries. Article 9 mandates that women will have an equal right with men to share, change, or retain their nationality and that of their children. Article 10, education. It obligates equal access to all fields of education and the elimination of stereotyped concepts of the role of men and women. Article 11, employment. It mandates the end of discrimination in the field of employment and recognizes the right to work as a human right. Article 12, health. It requires steps to eliminate discrimination from the field of health care, including access to family planning. If necessary, these services must be free of charge. Just think about that. Article 13, economic and social life. It requires that women be ensured equal access to family benefits, bank loans, credits, sports, and cultural life. Article 14, rural women, focuses on the particular problems faced by rural women. Article 15, equality before the law. It guarantees equality before the law and equal access to administer property. Article 16, marriage and the family, requires steps to ensure equality in marriage and family relations. And then the rest of the treaty talks about the committee that has been established to implement its provisions. So far, 187 countries have ratified CEDAW. 6 have not. Guess what? The U.S. is the only Western industrialized country that has not ratified CEDAW. We are in the company of Iran, Sudan, Somalia, Palau, and Tonga. So I just wanted to quickly go through that, and as we mentioned, we've been working a number of decades to try to get the U.S. government to ratify CEDAW, and we can talk about a number of reasons that we haven't accomplished that goal. But in the meantime, that was one of the reasons that we out here in the Bay Area decided that we were not going to wait until the U.S. government ratified CEDAW, that we would take it upon ourselves to have what we call local ratification of CEDAW, and that's the 1998 city and county ordinance from San Francisco that resulted from that. Okay. San Francisco and California does it again. And so we already mentioned the latest in that. On Tuesday, there's going to be a hearing before the state Senate Judiciary in Sacramento to discuss a bill, and the bill is SCR 78. And in summary, the measure would acknowledge that there is a continued need for the state of California to protect the human rights of women and girls and to analyze the operations of state departments, policies, and programs to identify discrimination and, if identified, to remedy that discrimination. The measure would support the implementation of the principles underlying the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So that's going to happen on Tuesday, and I think we have a letter that we want people to sign on, and that we will deliver that to Hannah Beth Jackson and Daniel Chu. And so that's the last thing, moving along. I heard a number of you talking about networking and wanting to know what others are doing who are interested in similar issues. And that's one of the backgrounds of our latest campaign called the Cities for CEDAW. And this is a campaign to protect the rights of women and girls by passing ordinances establishing the principles of CEDAW in cities and towns across the United States. It's making the global local. And WIN is the peer NGO organization. The San Francisco Commission on the Status of Women, Department on the Status of Women, was the peer governmental entity. And since then, we've added the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, also working on that. And you will hear the panelists talk about some of their work. But this is the latest in our work to get the cities and other entities, even counties or whatever, to do what we've done in San Francisco, what we've done in Berkeley, Los Angeles, and what have you, to do that in parallel with hopefully maybe one day getting CEDA ratified by the US government. And on that note, I'm going to stop. We have a lot of information. The website for Cities for CEDA is citiesforceda.org. And there's a lot of information on there. We have a web blog. We have a list of resources, contacts. There's a list of cities and counties that have already passed resolutions. And I have some handouts for you that we will be given to the whole table. But on that note, I want to transition to our conversation that we are going to have. And what we thought we would do is to have representatives of various cities, regions, who have participated in the Cities for CEDA campaign so far, and to have them tell you about some of their experiences. And let me introduce the two panelists. We have Sarah Almond-Pike. Sarah, raise your hand. Has had a long passion for women's rights. To be so long, she's had a long passion to be so young, to have a long passion. But anyway, she has a joint honors BA degree in international development and gender studies from McGill. And while she was there, she worked at the Montreal Sexual Assault Crisis Line. And she interned for an international indigenous rights organization. When she moved to California, she has been on the board of the United Nations Association, the UNUSA Mid-Peninsula chapter. And she's leading the campaign, the Cities for CEDA campaign for Palo Alto. And she's also director of a publishing for a young education company. And in the intervening time, she just started her first year at Boat School of Law the other day. And Gloria Salas, Gloria is here, flew up from LA, was born and raised in Los Angeles, and she still resides in the county of LA. And as she says, her mother was one of her earliest influences in her hometown back in Mexico in the 40s. And she taught Gloria and her siblings that every woman had untapped power within herself, and once that realization broke through the surface, each woman could use that power, and the world had better get out of the way. So she was instilled with that as a young child. She attended Pepperdine University, and she graduated with a degree in legal studies, and until recently she was an office manager of a 60-person law firm in LA. But she still works in the legal field, but she's doing a lot more advocacy these days. And she's a member of the Zonta Club of Burbank and its service and advocacy committees. And she recently returned from Washington, D.C., where she and her Zonta sisters advocated before the U.S. representatives regarding the ERA Campus Accountability Act and CEDA. So those are our two panelists. And we're very fortunate to have them. So I'm going to ask them a series of questions. We're going to have a conversation, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards. So Sarah, how did you get started and get involved with CEDA? And why were you motivated to do so?
Sure. Thank you, Julianne. Before that, I just want to say that I'm so humbled to be here with so many people who have been working on CEDA for decades. Coming from Canada, I'm very new to this fight because Canada has ratified CEDA, and I'm happy to speak to the ways in which I think that was beneficial coming from Canada, but I just wanted to acknowledge all the great work, and very happy to be here speaking with all of you, so thank you. I got involved with CEDA in part in the US because I was so shocked to learn that the United States had not ratified. Then seeing that it was unlikely that we would, as a nation, be passing it in Washington, it made a lot of sense to me to focus locally. To borrow a little bit from Teresa's excellent remarks, it's a lot easier to fight discrimination locally. And to follow up on what you've been saying, Julianne, and others, there's no need for us to wait, right, for what we want to see in our communities and the values that we want to be living out. So it made a lot of sense to me that, okay, we have this great mechanism, CEDAW. It sounds a little bit intimidating, but in practice, it really just means let's take a gender lens to look at policy at the local level, and let's bring this home and let's implement it city by city. So that's how I got involved down in Palo Alto. We have a small team of 3 people, which has been quickly growing, and I'm happy to speak to that later on, to the details of it. Okay. I think I'm also here as a bit of a messenger because I was incredibly fortunate to attend a meeting of various Cities for CEDAW advocates in New York City during the Commission on the Status of Women back in March, and I'm happy to speak to all the wonderful things as well as the challenges that I heard from the various representatives and cities there.
Okay. Gloria?
Thank you again for the invitation to come here. The way I got started was purely by accident. Up until a year ago, I had no idea what CEDAW was, didn't know how to spell it, and people had to continuously tell me what the letters meant. I belong to Zonta International with our local club in Burbank. One of our members, who was lieutenant governor of our region at the time, happened to attend a meeting up here in San Francisco, and this is where she heard for the first time the word CEDAW. So she came down, and because she was lieutenant governor and she had to oversee quite a few states, she asked us if anybody was interested in doing some research about it. Had to do with women's rights, and of course that pregnant pause. No one raised their hand. So I raised my hand. And I started doing the research. I didn't do it right away, but within a few weeks I went online, I Googled, Google is your best friend. I found out about Cities for CEDAW. And I saw a list of names with their email addresses, so I just randomly chose all these strangers and sent them emails asking them for information, what it meant to their city, how they started, what their challenges were. And within a month, I received my first response from Dade County in Florida. And then she, in turn, told me, you should contact this person in Los Angeles. And she put me in touch with several people in Los Angeles. And one of those, Marisela Arceli, told me, get in touch with Marilyn Fowler. And then from there, Marilyn's been holding our hand, and she has actually come and given a presentation to our Zonta Club, letting us know what it is exactly, what we need to do. And at the time, it was difficult simply because no one knew about it. And what motivated me in my research, I found, actually being a member of Zonta for just a few years, I found that Zonta International had actually supported the ratification of CEDAW and was asking all its members to please advocate to their government leaders to continue with this process. So I brought this back, and also CEDAW aligns very well with the principles of Zonta's mission, which is women's rights are human rights. And that's how I started, and that's what motivated me.
And so let's move to some of the activities, Sarah, that you have done down in the Mid-Peninsula and your work with Cities for CEDAW.
Certainly. So they've been very humble, but they've been effective. I think a point I'd really like to drive home is that there's no magic in passing CEDAW. There's no special way that you absolutely have to go about it. There's no one-size-fits-all for each and every city. It's just a lot of hard work, but also fun work, and that's going to be different for each city. But in Palo Alto, what we did was we started by contacting our mayor at the time, who was a woman and who we thought would be very interested. We got her on board to be an advocate for us, and we didn't move fast enough. New mayor was elected, and we had to start over. So from that, we learned a really important lesson, which was to sort of build out a broader coalition and to find multiple points of access and multiple avenues through which we were going to push to try and get this done. To have everything riding on one person was not the way to go, which is also something we heard a lot about from the other cities in New York, trying to go through multiple avenues. So what we've been doing now is we have a member of our city council who we approached, who we knew would be interested. We mainly knew that because his mother was a long-standing member of the AAUW, and he was a great promoter of women's rights, and we approached him and got him on board. Something then somewhat serendipitous happened, which was that because of the current political context, he was looking to pass a resolution in Palo Alto reaffirming the values of inclusivity and acceptance and openness in Palo Alto, unfortunately due to racist, anti-Semitic graffiti and other things that have been happening in the city. Now, what turned out to be, in a way, positive about that was that the community said, absolutely not. This is not acceptable, and this member of city council, along with others, passed a resolution to reaffirm the values that we did want. What we were able to do was really rally behind the city councilor, go and speak at oral argument of the city council meeting, really activate people we knew to help get that passed, and it did pass. So now we had done something that in of itself was valuable, and we also had the city councilor who felt, okay, I want to help this group go forward. Since then, we've also been approaching the Human Relations Commission. So most cities would have a Human Relations Commission, which would likely be the most reasonable way to have maybe an oversight body without creating a new one, or the most likely group to bring this forward. We've gotten them on board, and they have decided just as of about 2 weeks ago, after we gave an informational meeting, to make this part of their working plan for the year. So they are now working on drafting a CDOT ordinance for Palo Alto. So again, it wasn't glamorous. We had an informational meeting in a church hall, and we just spoke to people, and we spoke to everyone we could find. We utilized our networks like the AAUW, who co-sponsored with us, other groups in our area, which is, again, something that seems to be a really successful strategy that we've been hearing from other cities. So don't go it alone. Work with other groups. And again, to think really broadly. I think it's really important going forward that we view this as an intersectional ordinance, right? We know that gender is not the only thing. Gender identity, race, socioeconomic status. Think broadly about what other kinds of groups share these same goals with us, and then bring them on board, because we're much stronger when we work together.
Thank you. And we'll come back to talk about New York City and whatever, but Gloria.
I'm just trying to figure out where to start. Now, a disclaimer, and as they say, what goes on in Vegas stays in Vegas. What I say now in this room stays in this room. I had no intention, when I was appointed by one of my council members to be on the Municipal Charter Review Committee, to add to it, or to suggest that we have CEDAW, or that we create a commission on the status of women. I had no inclination, didn't even think that far. I was just looking at the charter. But as I read the charter, and I read it over and over and over again, I thought, there's no mention of women. There's nothing about policies towards women or girls. So when it came down to the recommendation, I suggested CEDAW, and of course no one knew about it, and I also suggested the creation of the Commission on the Status of Women. And of course the city attorney, who is a woman, said why. So, and I started to explain why. And fortunately, there were 5 of us on this review committee. 2 of us were women. There were no objections. It passed unanimously to recommend to the council a creation of the Commission of Women and the Status of Women. But CEDAW was going to be a little bit more difficult because nobody knew what it was. And as soon as I mentioned it, one of the gentlemen there almost sprang from his chair and said, "That comes from the UN High Commission, and there is nothing that that body has for us. There is no foreign government that is going to regulate our laws, no foreign government that's going to review anything that this country." It was, I'm not sure where he was receiving this information, but I had already been told that one of our council members was going to veto anything that had to do with the UN. So we were told when it came to CETA to wait until this recent election. And if he was voted out, then we had a better chance. He was voted out, and now we have 2 women on the council, and a plus is that one of those women happens to be a member of the Zonta group. So she is on board with this. We have to just convince our second female council member to get on board. And then the other 2, one of the other council members has said that whatever I want to do, he will back me. And, but it's difficult. It seems like it's going to be simpler to create a commission on the status of women so that we'll have an organization, because we don't have a human relations committee in Burbank, but to have a CSW that would be able to back CEDAW. However, I have been attending quite a few CSW meetings throughout the county, and one of them actually gave me a very good idea. Just ask the councilwoman to have her make the request to have it ratified, or at least make it into a resolution. And then from there, you see where the rest of the council, where the public is going to come out in their public opinions. So it's a slow process for us.
But it seems like there's some commonalities in you're all talking about the political context in which to do this work, and that's very, very important. I see we have 5 minutes left. What would you say some of the challenges are and lessons learned, just briefly? You've touched on some of that.
Well, as Sarah mentioned, doing the backdoor type of politicking and going and starting to talk to people, and that's what we're doing. We're getting some of the people in different organizations that are maybe not all women, like the Rotary and the Kiwanis, and also talking to some of those people and women members on the boards and commissions that are in place right now through the City of Burbank. But also, the City of Burbank is looking at a deficit of a few $1 million, and so they're also looking at the boards and commissions and determining which ones they're going to eliminate. So that was another question as to, if we're going to eliminate some boards and commissions, why do we need another one? But we think that we have pretty good support, and again, it's not putting all our hopes on one person, because that person may not be there again. So we're trying to make sure that we get at least the councilwoman who's a Zontian to go ahead and push this forward.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with everything that Gloria said. I think, the issue of turnover, and then we know, okay, the way we address that is we get as many different people as we can. A couple of other things that you mentioned, Gloria, I also heard in New York. So hesitation around this language of the UN and people who have pushback against the UN. One way around that is to try and educate people about the UN, and we can hopefully do 2 good things at once in that way. If there's a real hesitancy, maybe we back off that language, and maybe we use language that's really, really localized and make it really specific to our cities. Those are some ideas we heard in New York. I think one of the major challenges is definitely funding, which Gloria alluded to. I think funding is so important, though. What we were hearing, and I see Emily Morales, who could speak so well to all of these issues, probably nodding her head that having money to put our money where our mouths are to make sure these things get done, that really trying at the outset to ensure that the funding is there when you pass an ordinance or a resolution, so you don't have to go back later and fight for it. And I think another issue is one of focus. We've heard today, and we're also aware that so much is going on right now, and a lot of difficult things, and people are tired. And I'm tired, and I have been at this for 2 years, and I feel tired. So again, my hats are off to people here who have been doing this work for so long. I think that that's what makes CDOG so great, is that it's very specific, it's very concrete. If you have people who are flailing around and are unsure what to do, call a friend who's in another city or in another state and say, hey, have you heard about CEDA? Here's what it is. Here's what the acronym is, which we all struggled with. It's really easy to learn. This is just a tool that you could use in your city and helping, bring things really to a concrete place where we can do something.
Thank you.
I know we're out of time, but I just want to say something very quickly. I came across an opinion piece that was put out by the League of Women Voters, 2009, where she ended with that women's issues are being pushed back from the front and center because of the crisis at the moment. When we went in June to advocate for CEDAW and for the ERA to our senators and our congressmen, their aides said, well, of course, we come from Burbank, so we've got very progressive representatives. We were told, we're with you, but there's a crisis in Washington now, so we're not going to focus. We can't focus on it. So we have to focus on it and keep pushing so that they will realize, okay, we're their constituents, and they have to listen.
So we've got 1 minute. I hope we've given you some idea of the contents of CEDAW, the treaty, and you've seen some ideas about the Cities for CEDAW campaign. And if you look around the world, CEDAW has meant such a difference in the countries that have ratified the treaty. Some countries have changed constitutional provisions. Others have adopted laws and resolutions in their home countries to deal with a host of issues, from education to healthcare to marriage and divorce. When I was in Brazil, they were revamping the whole Constitution, and they lifted out complete provisions and parts of CEDAW and put them in the Brazilian Constitution. And so there've been changes all over the world. It's possible. That's just one example, and we have more information. And I think hats off to the Cities for CEDAW, the San Francisco Department on the Status of Women, who went to the committee, the UN Oversight Committee of CEDAW, back at a meeting in, November 2015. And it was the first time there had been a report based on CEDAW from the United States. Because the US government hasn't ratified the treaty, there was no official governmental report like they are required to do. But civil society was invited to come to speak to this group. It's an expert group of 23 experts from around the world. They were invited to come to talk about the Cities for CEDAW campaign, and a number of the representatives from those particular countries were very excited, and they were going back to their home countries and say, we should do something like this also. So I hope that we have given you some idea of the possibilities. And I want to thank Gloria and Sarah for the panel. Oh, okay, yeah. A few questions. How much time? A few questions, comments. Yes.
Hi, I'm Renee, and it's sort of a multi-part question. So I've been reading a lot on this since I found out about it, and I think it's exciting that cities are doing this, but what I worry about is that it's either going to be the large cities like LA, the progressive cities like Burbank and San Francisco, or the very educated cities like Palo Alto, rather than Concord, where we live, or heaven forbid, Larimore, North Dakota, where my son is. It's not going to happen there. I just don't think it will. And it seems like the main reason that it hasn't passed is the Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, it isn't a political issue, don't pass any human rights treaties. I mean, I was reading that the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's us and Sudan that hasn't passed it. So, I mean, pretty much it's us and Sudan that aren't doing this, but it's because they don't want to break our American sovereignty. it's not that they're not agreeing with most of what's in here, they don't want others overseeing what we're doing. So my question after all that is, has there been any type of cities combining together to try to create a national CEDA that has similar things that's national, so that we're overseeing ourselves, which seems to be the biggest holdup of passing CEDA?
Well, I think I remember, and a number of us were there when the mayors, remember when the mayors, the Conference of Mayors met here in San Francisco? Maybe Emily can say something about that. And I specifically remember we were sitting at tables, we broke into tables, and I remember the mayor of Concord was at our table, and he was very interested in what we were doing. So there's possibilities there. And to try to, and Emily, you want to add something? And I know Rita, you were involved. Yeah.
It's a good point. But Cities for CEDA has members, cities of Salt Lake City and Louisville, Kentucky. And those people have told me, you know, it really doesn't help us that San Francisco was the first. But so they talk about good government. This is really about holding your local government accountable for spending just as much money on women and girls as they do with men on boys. And so you can talk about it as, you know, women's human rights. You can also talk about it as good government and accountability.
And we can also recommend some literature that talks about various myths that are surrounding what would happen if we ratified CEDA, and it has to do with taking the responsibility of the family away from parents and what have you and stuff. We know that there's ratification of CEDA, and then in the U.S., this treaty is considered what we say non-self-executing, which means that you would have to have some type of domestic legislation to implement the provisions of CEDA. Although, as an international treaty, if we were to have ratified it, it would be part of the supreme law of the land. And so it's just how you pick a strategy in terms of looking actually where you are. I think someone said that no one strategy fits all. You just have to take, to look at the climate, the political climate in your particular area, because we're not only talking about cities, we're talking about counties. I've heard someone talking about, we talked earlier about a village doing it and stuff. And so it's just like with any political activity or action or advocacy you want to do, you really have to sit down and have those kinds of conversations among your allies in terms of how you progress. But at our table, we were talking about one of the issues was about bail here in the U.S. as an issue, because poor people cannot pay bail, and either they remain in jail or they go ahead and say they're guilty just so that they can get out of jail. And we were talking about our Senator Kamala Harris is now working with Rand Paul on the issue of bail. And so it's like just picking your allies and trying to work with people to work on these issues. And it's a hard task, but it's something we think is worth doing. Yes. And then, speak up, Jane.
I'm Jane Bernard Powers, and I'm from here in San Francisco. I'm with WIN and Democratic Women. I'm with WIN and Democratic Women in Action. One of the obvious resources here is that we have a community, that would be San Francisco, that has implemented CEDA and has people, example, a mayor, and other people in the government who could very well put out their hand to a city like Daly City or Los Angeles. And it seems to me that using the networks that would naturally come from the organization of CEDA is one of the ways that we would go about implementing this. And it seems to me if you are a CEDA city, it would be incumbent on the mayor to reach out the hand and say, how can I help? That might be, I think that's actually quite reasonable. I'll be sharing that one.
Hi, I'm Carletta Jackson Lane. I'm Carletta Jackson Lane, Executive Director, Sojourner Truth Foster Family Agency. I'm also a member of the Mayor's Task Force on Anti-Trafficking, Commission on Status of Women. I'm a former Commissioner on Status of Women. And what I thought about was, do we have anyone in our current administration, the Trump administration, and specifically the person who was appointed over the UN under Trump's administration, where someone could actually speak to her directly in regards to CEDAW, and also the fact that Trump's daughter received these millions of dollars to help with anti-trafficking. And the reason why I felt that it's possible that maybe someone from the national level yourself would actually communicate with them directly, because there is a possibility that Trump's daughter, maybe she really doesn't mean what she's saying around trafficking, and maybe she doesn't know about WIN and the rest of us, and the possibility of what kind of, international world impact could be made if she could get into her father's ear in reference to CEDAW in the United States.
And the WIN delegations to the annual meeting of the Commission of Status of Women, I know that each year they reach out to the U.S. mission at the UN to talk with the delegations, and that's one direct way to do it. And I don't know how successful you've been. I haven't been there in a few years now because of my duties at the law school, but that is one way we used to have direct contact with those members of the administration who were there actually to attend the sessions. They were part of the delegation on the Commission on the Status of Women to talk about those issues. And Marilyn and Rita, you can say something.
I wanted to say something else in response to the woman that asked about, is there any U.S. Ability to collaborate on something? And that, of course, that's what Cities for CEDAW is. Emily and I are co-chairs nationally out of California for the Cities for CEDAW campaign. And as you mentioned, we went to Geneva and they loved our model for that. But I also want to let you know that one of the things that WIN did at the UN last year, because the U.S. has never had a caucus at the UN, believe it or not. A lot of other countries, there's a European caucus, I know there's a Czech lobby, and we had never had that entity. So we now have, for the U.S., a U.S. Women's Caucus. And it's launched, and if you have an organization, you can join that. We're just putting it together, and so we hope at the UN in March that we will have a lot of U.S. women there. That will give us a lot more power to get these kinds of issues before the UN commissions and leadership.
And the last question. Or comment, yeah.
Sorry. I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to, my name is Linda Calhoun, and I'm president of the Friends of the Commission on the Status of Women. And on November 3rd, and there's flyers in the back, we're having a breakfast at the Marriott Marquis Hotel. And it's going to be honoring members who are supportive in various areas of the principles of CEDAW. So I hope you'll grab a flyer and join us there.
Okay. Thank you.
So wanted to make sure that I take a moment to thank and acknowledge the great work by Marilyn Fowler, who's been our leader on CEDAW. And thank you, Marilyn, for getting me involved from the time that I worked for, even before I worked for John Burton, I think. I've been following following her footsteps and getting engaged, and so thank you for the opportunity to be part of that, and with Emily Murase, such great work that the call to action is about how do we make sure everything has a ripple effect. So thank you, Marilyn, for all your work. And now Kathleen has a question for our panel, and then we'll thank our panel.
It's not so much a question, is an answer to what you're saying. But number one, because we're not breaking up into tables, one of the things that Julianne did was we have an incredible amount of resources on CEDAW. Not only who's been doing it, so what she can do is we'll put them up here, and you do come up, or here, we do come up and get them. I mean, they're going to answer every question. They give you strategies. They give you whatever. I do not want those not to do.
I definitely want a copy of that.
Yes. The other thing is, to answer that about the UN and what you were talking about, you have to understand our president appointed an ambassador, Nikki Haley, to the UN, and who usually, when we go to the Commission on the Status of Women, we will have a briefing from the U.S. representatives like Nikki Haley and what have you. They canceled that this time. That doesn't mean we lost our voice. It just means we had to find a different way to do it, because many of the staff and others are very committed to a lot of our issues. What that really says to us when you ask how we do it is that means we have to be much more innovative and creative in approaching them individually and telling them and getting them on board, whatever our language that we are using, like Ivanka Trump and what she can do, how we can use her to further our causes. So I'm saying that that is exactly what you have to do with your individual cities. You really do have to be very innovative and talking, and I wanted to reaffirm what you were saying, going to many different people in the city. City of Oakland, we know they passed a resolution, but nothing happened. But what we've discovered is our city attorney, Barbara Parker, is very much for this. So we're now beginning a conversation of how to create an ordinance before they even begin to think about it, because we're going through the back door, if you will, because we know that they're sort of, it was a former mayor, sort of supportive, but they aren't really looking at it. So we're coming up with another way of bringing it up. It's going to be a long conversation, but we're literally looking at an ordinance before we even begin to do it. So the thing is, bring in together a bunch of group of you, I mean, it doesn't have to be just one, and you'd be surprised what you can get done. Slow but sure, and it's talking to everyone you can think of until we're all together.
Thank you. And we just want to thank our panelists, Sarah Almond Pike and Gloria Salas, and thank you, Julianne, for moderating and teaching us more about CEDAW. And I know that some folks have more information than others, and there'll be an opportunity to talk to people about that, get the information. And also on the tables, there's a sheet of paper, so that as they have the hearing and the Judiciary Committee on CEDAW, I think it's on Monday, we want to make sure we send a letter with the signature, with this, I guess we're sending a photo to David Chu, our assembly member, so that they can take that, hopefully make that part of the record of public comment during the hearing. So thank you for that. And also, there's one, could you hold it up? There's a, Molly, could you hold that piece of paper up, please? So if you, Marilyn wanted us, we could all sign this if you'd like. So that's for the hearing on CEDAW that's going to be sent to the representatives. We have a question, yes?
There is another way to go other than simply asking for CEDAW to be incorporated, the principles of CEDAW to be incorporated. We did it in Berkeley. It took 9 years after the City Council approved the adoption of the principles of CEDAW into municipal law in Berkeley. It took 9 years to get it actually through the process in the city. But here's the other, I think, a rather important path that you can follow. There are ways to ask for CEDAW to be strengthened in your community. It is not just one way, that is, that they have to adopt the principles into law. Some of our colleagues in Richmond and in the city of Davis, as well as in Berkeley, have had the city council adopt in favor of ratification of CEDAW or supporting the principles of CEDAW. You can do partial work as you aim towards more firm legal positioning. But don't feel as though you have to go for the law or nothing. You can get support. There are counties that are ready to do support. Alameda County is one. And across the country, there are state governments that are adopting support principles for CEDAW. What we're doing then is getting it into the public discourse. So try not to feel as though if you haven't done that, you can't do anything. You can do modifications. So my question, is there a central place where people can go into a web or a phone call to find out where their questions can be answered? I'm willing to add my name to that list if there is.
Marilyn?
Yeah.
There's a great website up that has everything you ever wanted to know about CEDAW. It's just CEDAW, citiesforcedaw.org. And there's a whole resource page. It has the 6 cities that have signed ordinance, maybe there's 7. 20 cities have resolutions now. 30, I don't know, we lose track, are engaged. Oh, she has a copy of that. Right. And be sure and fill this out and leave it with us because you can be, there's ways that you can be involved with us.
I'm going to leave you with a quote that from Eleanor Roosevelt, who said, "It is better to light a candle than curse the darkness." So let's light many candles and go on and light the way for so many people who are obviously in the dark about many things.